Have you noticed some emotional heaviness in your work with clients that have persisted throughout the pandemic? How do we as therapists continue to take care of ourselves in meaningful ways as we are at risk for compassion fatigue? Furthermore, how might compassion fatigue impact therapists of color? And what are some strategies at the macro and micro level that we can adopt to help ourselves, our clients, and our communities? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sen. Our guest today is Natasha D'Arcangelo. She is a licensed mental health counselor at Headspace Health, a Florida qualified supervisor, and a professional speaker. Natasha has spoken openly about compassion fatigue and burnout. As a person who identifies as Guyanese American, Natasha has worked in digital health tech environments and been on several media appearances speaking about diversity topics. Natasha, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Tell me a little bit about how did you get into the work of mental health? And I think another thing our guests may be interested is the speaking engagements, being a public speaker.
Mhm.
That's something that some people might be interested in terms of trying to diversify their work. So how did you just get into this field?
Sure. So we have to go back in time a little bit. This is actually a second career for me. I was a teacher once upon a time. And one of the reasons that I left teaching is because it felt like I was not making enough of an impact. It was very focused. I was from New York originally, so I was living in New York at the time. And there was a lot of pressure on students to perform well on the state tests. And that just was not why I got into teaching. So ended up moving down to Florida and started working for Argosy University. And one of the perks was that I got to do a free master's degree and was going to do school counseling or school psychology. And one of my colleagues encouraged me, why don't you do a mental health counseling degree so that you can work with any population? And changed my life because that's what I ended up doing. And fast forward 60 credits, licensure later, and here I am. I've always known that I wanted to be a helper. I've always known that I wanted to make a difference in other people's lives. And at this point in my career, I just feel so privileged, really, to do the work that I do, and really honored, to be a part of the lives of my clients and be able to witness their growth and celebrate moments with them. And, I genuinely love what I do, and it is incredibly fulfilling for me. So that's how I ended up here. And the funny thing is even though almost all of my professional experience for most of my life was with kids, now I work primarily with adults. And it turns out I like working with adults too. So never would have guessed that for myself, but here I am. I always say, as far as the professional speaking stuff, I kind of fell into professional speaking by accident. It started back in the beginning of the pandemic when everybody was, at home and locked in. At the time, I was working for a private practice in Orlando, and they had approached the psychiatrist that owned the practice I was working for, a couple of different folks in the community, and said, hey, would you be willing to, just answer some mental health questions? Folks have a lot of uncertainty, and it'd be nice to hear from a mental health professional. And she sent it to me. She said, I'm not comfortable doing this. Would you be willing to do these interviews? And so it began. I never would have dreamed that it would have come to this. But what I've realized is there is a real thirst for people to hear from mental health professionals. People have so many questions. There's a lot of mystery around therapy. So I've kind of taken it in two different directions. One is destigmatizing mental health care. So just answering some general questions. How do I find a therapist? How do I know it's a good fit? And people don't know these things. It seems common sense to you and I, but for most people, that's very confusing to navigate. And then professionally, well, I've really become a subject matter expert on compassion fatigue and burnout. And so, I've really been privileged to I presented at the National Board of Certified Counselors last year as part of their symposium. I was one of the session speakers for the American Mental Health Counseling Association at their fall summit. The Florida Counseling Association had me last year as their plenary speaker. So if folks are looking into getting into that work, I do consulting around that. So feel free to reach out to me. But what I would encourage you to do is think about what you're passionate about and think about what you're really a subject matter expert on, because it helps if it's a specific thing. So, when you're talking to places and looking to put together some kind of proposal, there's a very big difference between depression, for example, and techniques for working with military veterans struggling with depression, right? And so you're going to have a much more effective presentation the narrower your topic is. So just kind of keep that in mind. And the other thing that I would encourage you to think about, because this is what I always get when I talk to colleagues who are like, I don't know how you do that. I could never do that. We are subject matter experts. All of us have to do continuing education. Many of us specialize in things. And I guarantee you, your colleagues want to hear from you. So yeah, that's how I got here.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. I suspect that, those are great tips for a lot of folks to take in because you're talking about, hey, a reframe process.
Mhm.
We are subject matter experts based on the clients we treat, based on our lived experience. Now, you mentioned you became a subject matter expert with compassion fatigue and burnout. This podcast is focused on people of color in mental health. So I am wondering if you've noticed as your role as a therapist and also as a supervisor, just thinking through what have you noticed in terms of themes that the clinicians are coming to you about or just speaking with you even as a colleague
Mhm.
relating to burnout and whether there's any differences amongst the different populations.
So yes, I would say as a whole, our field is tired. For many colleagues of mine, I think that they were pretty tired before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and the demand and increase for mental health services really skyrocketed. And collectively, we have a hard time saying no when there are people in need. And so I know so many people who, I did it myself too back in 2020, where I was working extra hours because I felt bad. I didn't want to turn people away. And also, the folks that I would normally refer to ended up being on a wait list. Everybody was full, right? And that's just one aspect of things. And so when I think about clinicians of color and also clients of color, there has been so much unrest with the political environment. I live in Florida. It's a highly politicized state. There's all the CRT stuff, and the governor is trying to ban AP African studies. And how do you as a clinician live in a state that's trying to erase your history
Mm,
and
mm,
and say that that's not valid, while you're also working with clients who are struggling through those issues too? And so I think that we're in a very interesting spot in society where we are living through these things, and also we are holding space for our clients who are living through these things, right? And that's a heavy burden to carry. And I don't really think that they adequately prepare us for that in grad school.
mm,
Now, I had a fantastic graduate school program. My professors were all working in the field. I really learned a lot from them, and felt well prepared to take on my internship. I don't think, though, that we address enough collectively as a field what it means to be working as a clinician of color in a field that historically has been dominated by old white men. Like, all of our theories are based on these theories that came from old white men, right?
yes. Yep.
Um, and so we don't have a lot of conversations about that. And there's a difference between when I have an African American male colleague who has been doing this work, and the things that he says to me about burnout, and what a female Hispanic colleague says to me about doing this work, right? And it's different. We hold spaces in the universe because we're humans first, and I don't know that that's often really talked about. One thing that really hit me personally is in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. I really, really struggled because I know I'm biased, but my nephews are the most beautiful little brown boys in the world. And, right now they're cute and they make friends wherever they go, and people smile at them. And I worry about when they're going to cross over that line into being perceived as dangerous. And part of the reason that I do the work that I do is because I want to make a more just world for them, where I don't have to worry about them walking down the street in a hoodie when they're 16. And I think that, and I feel that. And I also have to hold space for clients that are experiencing that too. Right. So it's the intersectional identities thing. We are not, one dimensional people. We have so many things going on in so many arenas of our lives. And most of the clinicians that I talk to don't give themselves the grace to explore those other areas, make space for those other areas, connect to other people in those areas. We tend to isolate around those. That's really the most common theme that I hear whenever I do a presentation on compassion fatigue and burnout is folks will come up to me afterwards and say, it was so validating to hear that, but we really should be supporting each other in these spaces. Nobody else gets what we do like the people that also do this work, right?
I love that you're talking about the intersectionality between compassion fatigue experience as a whole for all the clinicians and the nuanced piece by being a person of color.
Yeah.
And also because we are in a helping profession, a lot of the interventions are based on what we are providing for the clients. Rarely are there topics about compassion fatigue. Well, we talk generally about self-care, but
Sure.
what does that look like? Well, what does it mean for a person of color? Yeah. Is self-care also a privilege concept?
You took the words right out of my mouth, because what do we oftentimes think about when we think about self-care? Oh, I'll go get a massage once a month, right? Well, that sounds fantastic on paper, but if I'm working with a single mom of two who's making minimum wage, holding down a job at Walmart, she's got to put food on the table. When is she going to find the time or the money to go get herself a massage once a month? And so, I think self-care has become this privileged concept that is out of the grasp of many of the folks that we work with.
Yeah. Prior to starting the recording, we had a conversation about social justice work. You alluded to some of this with your nephews and some of why you're thinking about, okay, how can you help others address this topic of race and bring that into a conversation in compassion fatigue? Because reality is we just don't talk about race enough. We just don't. It's like a taboo, fearful topic.
Yep.
Or some folks may get defensive talking about it. And so can you share with me your idea of clinicians doing social justice work?
So I think that, first of all, we have to understand that social justice work is counseling work. It's not a separate thing. It's not a different category, right? If you are not actively working for the rights of your clients at a macro level, it doesn't really matter what you're doing for them at a micro level in your individual sessions, right? So for me, that's looked a few different ways. I am a member of the American Counseling Association, and last year, let me back up before I get into my next point. If you are not a member of your professional organizations, then you need to join some professional organizations. As a licensed mental health counselor, I'm a member of the American Counseling Association, the American Mental Health Counseling Association, and I'm board certified through the National Board of Certified Counselors, right? And all three of those organizations are doing work at a macro level, at a legislative level, to make changes in our field. There is power in numbers. And if they don't have members to be part of those numbers, then advocacy is not happening as a whole. Last year alone, in 2022, the Counseling Compact passed and became law for us to be able to practice across state lines once those governing bodies figure out what the details will look like. And just this past week, I think Wisconsin was the newest state to join. I apologize if that's not correct. So that's huge. Another thing that happened last year because of advocacy through those professional organizations is counselors can now bill under Medicare. That is not something we were able to do before. It would not have happened, right? So you need to join professional organizations. And the story I was going to get to is through the American Counseling Association, I have a mentee. She's a lovely young lady, lives in North Carolina, is still in grad school, and we meet once a month typically. And she's African American, and so we kind of talk about what it's like to be a BIPOC person in this space. And she goes to a predominantly white school, and so there's some, tension there. But it's really nice for her to be able to speak to somebody that's not affiliated with her school in any way. I'm not a professor, not her site supervisor. I'm a touch base for her. And that's part of my advocacy work, right? When I had, right after George Floyd's murder, I had a lot of my white clients approach me, which is really interesting. And I don't know if it's because of how I present or because of the fact that I'm very obviously brown, and so they felt more comfortable. But I had a lot of white clients say to me, wow, I didn't know that America was this racist. And they were genuinely surprised. And so that was an opportunity for me to say, I could have said, well, I don't talk about race in therapy, right? That's not what we're here for. That's not what I did. I leaned into it. I said, well, tell me a little bit more about that, right? And is this something that you want to work on? Is this important to you to start to make changes around? If so, I'm happy to help you make a plan to do that. What does that look like for you? And so it's leaning into those conversations. And I think that the more of those conversations we have, the more that we're able to make systemic change, right? The other piece of it is, what are you doing? I always tell my clients, if there is a problem that feels too big, you can do something in your corner of the universe for that problem. Right now in Florida, they are actively legislating against LGBTQIA plus bodies, right? I have no idea why folks can't just let trans kids live their lives. However, I can't solve that problem on my own. What do I have the power to do, and what am I doing? For me, what that looks like is I'm a member of the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, subdivision of the of AMCA, and we have a subcommittee, SAGE, that works specifically for issues with LGBTQ, populations, issues, legislation, that kind of thing. And whenever they put out a call that's like, hey, we need you to contact your elected representatives, I contact my elected representatives. If they are sending out a petition, I sign the petition and I forward it to my colleagues that I know are also aligned. I put it on my social media. Hey, trans lives are being attacked again. Can you sign on to this thing? Can you reach out, right? Before I think it was the Board of Health put in its newest, because there's several iterations of this, its newest ban on trans care. They were looking for comments from the community. They were looking from comments for people for opinions on this. And believe you me, they heard from me about what my opinion is on this and how it's not actually based on any science and goes against WPATH standards as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics and all of those things. And so that's what that advocacy work looks like for me. Because when I'm sitting with a trans client in session, and this happened to me last week, and they're looking at me and they're telling me I feel like I'm being persecuted and I'm scared to go out in public, I need to be able to look them in the eyes and know that I'm doing all that I can with the power. I have cis het privilege. Nobody questions when I walk into the ladies' room in a Target. And nobody's trying to legislate what bathroom I'm allowed to use when I go out in public, right? So, what am I doing with my cis het privilege that I hope eventually will impact those clients that I'm working with? I need to know that I'm doing all that I can at the macro level to make a difference in their lives. Because my opinion is if I'm not doing those things, I'm also not doing right by them in my individual sessions.
Yeah, yeah. So really having a lot of integrity in your work and to feel authentic and connected with your clients in a way that you feel, hey, I get you. And also, even if in our case, yes, we are people of color,
Mhm.
even within that segment, we still hold certain privileges.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. And throughout your work, I'm wondering, were there things that you learned that you didn't expect?
I think that one of the biggest things that I learned is there was so much of an emphasis in grad school, and I don't know how universal this is for folks, but well, what's your theory? What's your theoretical orientation, right? And in every single class, we have to talk about our theory and our theoretical orientation. And for me, one of the things that surprised me was I didn't really connect to a theoretical orientation. I kind of was like, I guess CBT if I have to choose a thing. But it really was my post grad work that helped me find what therapeutic approach felt the most comfortable for me. And the other big surprise was that I got into trauma work. I never would have expected that for myself. Never would have predicted that for myself. And yet I love working with folks that have pretty extensive histories of trauma. It is just personally gratifying for me to see them live higher qualities of life, you know? So never would have predicted that for myself. And yet here I am and really enjoying it. I also never would have I'm still in touch with a couple of my good friends from high school, and I said, who would have thought that I ever would have become a public speaker? I mean, in high school, I was that kid who felt ready to throw up before she had to give her presentation in front of her class. And now here I am, I give presentations to audiences as large as 300, not even bat an eyelash. Never would have predicted that for myself, right?
And can you share how your racial background may have created that trajectory or shift for you?
Yeah, so I always say I'm the proud child of immigrant parents, and my parents immigrated to this country from Guyana in the 1970s, and at that time it was very much about assimilation. And so professionally, for example, like my mom tried to lose her accent, and if you were to talk to her on the phone, you would not know that she's Guyanese. So, fun fact for you, when you grow up with a Guyanese parent who has deliberately lost their accent, you can gauge how upset she is by how strong her accent is. So, my brother and I knew when we were getting into trouble when she started sounding more Guyanese. Um, so one of the things that happened because assimilation was kind of what my parents did in order to be able to succeed in this country is I was essentially taught that I needed to assimilate as well. I needed to blend in. I needed to not bring attention to myself. And that has been what I have done for most of my professional life, tried real pretty much every single one of my previous bosses will tell you I'm a really hard worker and I say yes and I work the later hours and do all those things. And it's because of my how my parents raised me. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that's been to my detriment because I have a hard time advocating for myself. And so if there is something that I need, if I, need a break or I'm looking for a promotion or, I'm really, really good at talking myself out of it because I don't want to bring attention to myself. And so my work at this point in my career has really been to try to find my voice and try to advocate for myself. And that's been a journey for me. And I've had some wonderful therapists along the way that have been helping me to figure out what that looks like. And that's another thing that I definitely would encourage people to do. We should be in therapy. Every therapist should have a therapist. It's not really fair for us to ask our clients to walk a journey that we've not taken ourselves, and made such a huge difference in my clinical work once I started working on my own stuff, right? So yeah, it's a really interesting place where my intersectional identities have come in. Even my teaching background, I say all the time, I don't know how to turn off the teacher part of my brain, but it plays a role in how I do therapy with my clients. It definitely plays a role in how I present in front of a room full of 300 people, having had as much experience as I have with curriculum building and lesson planning and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear you describe how you've flipped this script, this family of origin script where, like you mentioned, hey, don't speak up. You need to be like the group, kind of sort of a collective
Yeah.
identity. And so, and you created a message that works for you because you're saying, well, I can now advocate for other and I still maintain this collective identity by advocating as a whole, focusing on systems.
Yeah.
And like you said, the macro level organizations that can create large work, that's more of a collective belief system that you carried over from
Mhm.
your family of origin experience.
Yeah.
And then to advocate. Wow. Wow.
If I could add in, one of the populations that I also really enjoy working with are clients that I consider myself first generation American. I was born in America. My parents were not. I know different people have different definitions. That's how I define it. And so, in my experience, folks that share that first generation American worldview, it seems that no matter where in the world our parents came from, we tend to have the shared identity of, whether it's overt or subtle, our parents came here to give us a better life. And so part of our responsibility is to make that sacrifice worthwhile. And for some of the clients that I work with, their parents told them that, like, we came here to give you a better life.
Yep.
And
Hmm.
so you need to make that sacrifice worth it. And for some of my clients, it's more subtle messaging. They kind of witnessed how hard their parents worked and, maybe didn't work in a field that they had an advanced degree in their country of origin. So that's also been, I think, a huge part of what I've learned along the way as well. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm. I'm curious, is there a recommendation you would give to therapists who work with BIPOC populations and they're struggling with, say, identity issues, issues with immigration, or just being a first generation, second generation immigrant? Because sometimes the acculturation factors change over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I cannot emphasize enough that you have to do your own work. We have resources for us to be able to find therapists that we share an identity with. And it's so important for you to be exploring those topics. It's so important for you to get to know yourself better on that level. There's anti-racist psychotherapy, for example, by Archer, out there there's books out there, there's things that you can connect to. You should be doing anti-racist work. actively, right? You should be reading. I know we have to do continuing education units, but also we really should never stop learning. Many times when we go to these conferences, we're just checking the boxes that we've, but be thoughtful about it. What sessions are you going to? And choose those things carefully, right? Like for example, because I do have cishet privilege, whenever I go to a training about working with LGBTQIA plus folks, I will only go to trainings with folks that have lived experience. Most effective techniques for working with trans teens, right? I want that to be presented by a trans clinician. So think too also about who are your sources that you're getting this information from, and just be thoughtful about that. Think about who you're supporting and where this information is coming from. So,
Being
but
very
yeah,
intentional about
own
picking your
work.
CU, your work.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And also thinking you're not just taking the CU,
Mhm.
you're adding as part of, I'm taking the CU, I'm also supporting the work of this person
Correct.
and the community.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Wow. Well, Natasha, where can listeners find you?
So right now, the easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn. So I'm easily searchable by my name, Natasha D'Arcangelo. There is an apostrophe between the D and the A. So definitely feel free to reach out to me. You can send me a message on LinkedIn. My email is my first name and my last name without the apostrophe, natashadarcangelo@gmail.com. Not a HIPAA compliant email address, so just keep that in mind. But definitely feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I would be remiss if I did not also mention the bulk of my compassion fatigue training has been done with Dr. Eric Gentry. And so if any of this compassion fatigue stuff seems like it's resonating with you, I cannot recommend his work highly enough. It wasn't until I found his stuff that I knew that I could sustain myself in this field. And I've been very privileged to be able to learn from him over the last few years. And he's got a YouTube channel, so a lot of his stuff is available for free, but it's Gentry, Dr. Eric Gentry, and his work on compassion fatigue. He is doing amazing work at the Forward Facing Institute, and he wants clinicians to be able to sustain themselves in this field. The world needs us now more than ever. And, the American Counseling Association, their most recent statistic last year is that only about 30% of licensed professional counselors identify under the BIPOC umbrella. So not only does the world need mental health counselors more than ever before, but we really need to bump up that BIPOC number.
Yeah.
And I think that the way to do that is by resolving our compassion fatigue.
Is there anything else you want to add? Any final thoughts or message you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, just thank you so much for listening. The work that you do is so, so valuable. And I appreciate you, and would encourage everybody to do what they need to take care of themselves, because we are really good at telling people that they need to put their own oxygen masks on first, but we're not so good at doing that for ourselves. So please take care of you.
Well, Natasha, I want to thank you for joining me today. This has been uplifting to hear, especially about the incorporation of social justice work. So thank you.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology.